For 22 years, I believed that both of my parents had died in a buggy accident before I was old enough to remember either of their faces. That is the story I had been told since I was old enough to ask questions, the story repeated by every aunt and every foster family who raised me along the way, the story I had built my entire understanding of myself around. And then, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, the most respected man in our entire district sat across from me at his own kitchen table and told me that the story I had spent my whole life believing was not actually true, and that he was the reason it had never been true, and that he was, in fact, my father. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I have had to sit with it for a very long time myself, and I am still, even now, working out exactly how I feel about a truth this large arriving this late in a life that had already been built so completely around its absence. My name is Rebecca. This is the story of the day I learned that the orphan I believed myself to be had actually had a father this entire time, a father who happened to be one of the most powerful and respected men in our community, and the complicated, painful, and ultimately healing months that followed that single devastating revelation. I want to tell you about the childhood I actually lived, because you cannot understand the size of what happened that Sunday afternoon without first understanding the particular shape of the life I had built in the absence of any real family. I was raised, from infancy, by a series of relatives and community foster arrangements, the kind that our world sometimes produces when a child loses both parents and no single family member is positioned to take on full responsibility alone. I spent my earliest years with my mother's sister, a kind but overwhelmed woman already raising 6 children of her own, who cared for me with genuine affection but limited capacity until I was nearly 6 years old. After that, I moved between 3 different households over the following decade, each one a family within our community willing to take in a parentless child as an act of Christian charity, each one providing for my physical needs with real care while never quite becoming, in any of the ways that mattered most to a growing child, something that felt like a true home. I do not say this to generate pity, because I want to be honest that my childhood, while undeniably difficult in the specific way that growing up without a permanent family is difficult, was not one of cruelty or neglect. I was fed, I was clothed. I attended church and school like every other child in our district. But there is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from never quite belonging fully to any single household, always being the additional child rather than one of the family's own, always sensing, however kindly you are treated, an invisible line between yourself and the children who actually belong to the families raising you. The story I was told about my parents was always the same, repeated with slight variations depending on who was telling it but consistent in its core details. My parents, Samuel and Anna, had been killed in a buggy accident on an icy road when I was 18 months old, struck by a vehicle that failed to see them in time, an accident tragic enough that it had become, in the retelling over the years, a kind of cautionary tale repeated to children throughout our district about the dangers of icy roads during winter travel. I had no memories of either of them. I had a single photograph, taken at their wedding, that my aunt had kept and eventually given to me, the only physical evidence I possessed that my parents had ever actually existed at all. I want to tell you about Bishop David Stoltzfus, because understanding who he was within our community is essential to understanding the size of what he eventually told me. Bishop David had led our district for nearly 20 years by the time of the events I am describing, having taken on the role relatively young, in his early 30s, after our previous bishop's unexpected resignation due to health concerns. He was, by every measure available to someone like me, growing up on the periphery of various households within his district, an enormously respected figure, known throughout our community for his wisdom in difficult pastoral situations, his fairness in matters of church discipline, and a particular gentleness with children that I had always found notable, even as a child myself, watching him interact with the various households that took me in over the years. I had known him my entire life, in the way that everyone in a tight-knit district knows their bishop, present at every gathering, every church service, every significant community event. He had always been kind to me specifically, in ways I had noticed without ever quite understanding why small gestures of attention that seemed slightly more personal than the general kindness he extended to every child in the district. He remembered details about my life that seemed, looking back now, unusually specific for a man responsible for the spiritual well-being of an entire district full of families. He had been present, in some capacity, at nearly every significant transition in my childhood. Each time I moved to a new household, each time I faced some new difficulty in adjusting to yet another family's particular rhythms and expectations. I had never once considered that this pattern of attention might mean anything beyond the ordinary pastoral care a thoughtful bishop extends to a parentless child in his district. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters to understanding how completely unprepared I was for what he eventually told me. The revelation came on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after my 22nd birthday, when Bishop David asked me, through one of the families I was currently boarding with, whether I might come to his house for a private conversation. A request unusual enough that I spent the entire walk to his property turning over every possible reason he might want to speak with me alone, none of which came anywhere close to the actual truth I was about to learn. He received me in his kitchen, his wife Miriam notably absent, having taken their younger children to visit relatives for the afternoon in what I would later understand had been a deliberate arrangement to ensure David and I would have complete privacy for this conversation. He offered me tea, and I remember, even now, the specific tremor in his hands as he poured it, a tremor I had never once observed in this famously steady and composed man during my entire life of watching him lead our community through every kind of difficulty. He told me, once we were both seated, that he needed to tell me something that he had carried for over 20 years, something he had decided, finally, he could no longer continue withholding from me now that I had reached full adulthood. He told me that the story I had been told about my parents' deaths was only partially true, that my mother, Anna, had indeed died, not in a buggy accident but during my birth itself, a complication that had taken her life within hours of bringing me into the world. But my father, he told me, his voice breaking in a way I had genuinely never witnessed from him before, had not died alongside her. My father was sitting across the table from me at that exact moment. I want to describe to you, as precisely as I can remember it, the specific sensation of hearing those words, because I think it is one of those rare moments in a life that fundamentally reorganizes everything that came before and after it. The kind of moment you find yourself returning to, examining from every angle, for years afterward. I felt, in the initial seconds after he spoke, a kind of complete cognitive freeze, an inability to process information that contradicted 22 years of settled understanding about who I was and where I came from. I asked him, when I finally found words again, how this was possible. How a bishop, a married man with a family of his own that I had watched grow over the years, could possibly be the father of a child he had allowed to be raised, parentless, moving between households throughout an entire childhood, while he himself lived less than 3 miles away, present at every significant community gathering I had also attended. What he told me next explained, finally, an entire complicated history that I had never had any reason to suspect existed. He told me that he had been a widower himself, briefly, before marrying his current wife Miriam, having lost his first wife to illness only 2 years into their marriage, before they had any children together. He told me that in the difficult period of grief following that loss, he had formed a relationship with my mother, Anna, a young woman from a neighboring district who had come to stay with relatives in our community during that same period, a relationship that had developed, over several months, into something neither of them had originally intended, given that he was still, at the time, formally within the mourning period. Our community's customs prescribed for widowers before remarriage was considered appropriate. He told me that my mother had become pregnant with me during this relationship, and that the two of them had faced an impossible situation, given the specific circumstances. A relationship conducted during his official mourning period with a young woman from outside our district would have created enormous scandal and disruption within a community he had only recently begun leading as its newly appointed bishop. He told me that he and my mother had made the difficult decision together that the pregnancy would be presented to the community as the result of a brief marriage to a man from her home district, a man named Samuel who did not actually exist, killed in a fabricated accident that would explain my fatherlessness without ever revealing the actual, far more complicated truth. I asked him, my voice shaking in a way that surprised me given how carefully I had always managed my own emotions throughout the difficulty of my childhood, why he had never told me the truth once my mother died, and the fabricated cover story became the only remaining explanation for my situation. He told me that in the immediate aftermath of my mother's death, overwhelmed by grief and by the practical crisis of a newborn child, whose existence threatened to expose the entire fabricated history he and my mother had constructed together, he had made what he now considered the single greatest mistake of his entire life. He had allowed the fabricated story to stand, had quietly arranged for relatives in the wider community to take me in as a parentless infant, and had told himself, in the immediate crisis of that decision, that he would find the right time, eventually, to reveal the truth and properly claim me as his daughter. That right time, he told me, with a depth of shame I had never witnessed from this composed and respected man, had never actually arrived, because every year that passed made the eventual revelation more complicated rather than less. He had married Miriam within 2 years of my birth, building an entirely new family that knew nothing of my existence. He had become more deeply established as our district's bishop, a position whose authority depended significantly on the community's trust in his moral character, trust that the truth of my origins, a child conceived during an inappropriate relationship during his mourning period for his first wife, would have seriously damaged if ever revealed. He told me that he had watched me grow up throughout our shared community, present at every gathering, observing every transition between households, carrying a guilt so large he had genuinely not known how to address it honestly without destroying the careful structure of authority and trust he had built across 2 decades of leadership. He told me that the specific catalyst for finally telling me the truth, after 22 years of careful silence, had been my recent 22nd birthday, a milestone that had apparently triggered in him an overwhelming recognition that he could not continue allowing me to move through adulthood believing myself entirely fatherless when the truth had been available, the entire time, less than 3 miles from wherever I happened to be living. I want to tell you about the weeks that followed this revelation, because they were, without question, the most disorienting period of my entire life. A grief and rage and confusion so completely tangled together that I genuinely struggled, for the first several days, to identify which specific emotion I was actually experiencing at any given moment. I felt rage at the sheer scope of the deception. 22 years during which this man had watched me move through a parentless childhood, attending the same church services, present at gatherings where he could have, at any point, simply told the truth and spared me the particular loneliness of belonging fully to no single family. I felt a complicated grief for the mother I had never known existed in any real specificity beyond a single wedding photograph. A mother who had died bringing me into a world that her own partner had then chosen to let me navigate without either parent, despite his continued presence throughout my entire life. I confronted his wife, Miriam, nearly 2 weeks after the initial revelation, having learned through David that he intended to tell her the truth as well. Finally, after over 20 years of marriage built partially on a secret this significant. Her reaction, when I eventually spoke with her directly, surprised me considerably. She told me that she had, in fact, suspected something for years, certain patterns of attention David had shown me throughout my childhood that she had never been able to fully explain, suspicions she had eventually set aside rather than directly confronting, partly out of fear of what the answer might actually reveal about the foundation of their own marriage. She told me, with a grace I had not expected given the size of what she had just learned about her husband's hidden history, that she did not blame me for any part of what had happened, that I had been an infant making no choices of my own when the original deception was constructed, and that whatever anger she felt toward David belonged entirely to him and not to me. I want to tell you about the slow, difficult process of building an actual relationship with my father, because I think this is the part of the story that surprised me most, given how completely unprepared I had been for the relationship even existing as a possibility. David and I spent the following several months in a careful, halting process of becoming acquainted as father and daughter, a strange inversion of the ordinary developmental process, since we had known each other, in some sense, for my entire life, but had never once related to each other within the actual context of what we now understood our relationship to be. I want to tell you about what happened within our wider community, because the revelation, once it became known beyond our immediate family, created exactly the kind of disruption David had spent 22 years fearing it would create. He confessed the full truth to our district's church council within a month of telling me, choosing voluntary disclosure over the risk of the truth eventually emerging through other means, a choice that I believe reflected genuine moral courage, even this late, given everything it cost him. The council's response was serious and lengthy, weighing the considerable weight of his decades of faithful and effective leadership against the genuine severity of both the original deception and the inappropriate relationship that had produced it during a period when our community's customs would have considered him still bound by mourning obligations to his first wife. He was ultimately permitted to remain in his role, though with a period of formal discipline and a public acknowledgement to the gathered congregation that I chose, after considerable thought, to be present for, partly because I believed my presence might offer some measure of healing to a community processing this revelation, and partly because I had come to understand, across those difficult months, that I wanted to be seen, finally and publicly, as exactly what I actually was, his daughter. Rather than continuing to exist as the community's collectively understood orphan, a role I had occupied my entire life without ever having actually been accurate. Here is what I have come to understand, looking back now on the entire trajectory of this story, from the 22 years of believing myself fully orphaned to the complicated, ongoing process of building a genuine relationship with the father who had been present, in some careful and guilty form, throughout my entire childhood. I do not believe the truth, however painful its late arrival, was worse than the alternative of never knowing it at all. I think, for a long time during those difficult initial weeks, I genuinely wondered whether ignorance might have actually been kinder, whether continuing to believe myself simply unlucky, parentless through nothing more complicated than tragic accident, might have spared me the additional grief of understanding exactly how much of my childhood loneliness had been, in fact, a choice someone close to me had made and then maintained across 2 full decades. But I have come to believe, now, with the benefit of more time and considerable reflection, that knowing the truth, however painful, gave me something that continuing ignorance never could have offered: an actual father, flawed and late and carrying genuine guilt, but real and present, and finally willing to claim me openly as his own. I think about the version of my life where David never found the courage to tell me, where I continued moving through adulthood believing myself entirely without family, and I understand now that whatever pain the truth brought with it, the alternative would have eventually cost me something I am not willing to imagine losing: the chance to actually know my own father, however imperfectly and however late that knowledge finally arrived. I thought I was an orphan for 22 years, until the most respected man in my entire community sat across from me at his own kitchen table and called me his daughter for the very first time. And in the months since that devastating, transformative conversation, I have slowly learned what it actually means to belong to someone. Fully and without the careful distance that had defined every household I had ever passed through before that single Sunday afternoon. Finally, gave me a father I had spent my entire childhood standing closer to than I had ever understood.